Good morning. I'm Saul Casson, and I am very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker for the day. When the Innocence Project was founded in 1992 by Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, I think nobody quite saw what was coming. And what was coming was an understanding of the causes and basis of wrongful convictions. Now, we all know in APLS that the most common cause of the wrongful convictions in the DNA cases are eyewitness cases. And all of the work that we've done over the years has resulted in a white paper. It has resulted in some important reforms. And we also know that another signal that came through in these cases had to do with false confessions, also resulting in a white paper and the start of some important reforms. What we have ignored in all of this, and if you look at the figure here, you can see the 47% sandwiched in between confessions and eyewitnesses, is that 47% of the cases in the DNA exonerations, 47% of them contain forensic science errors in evidence. Most of those are innocent mistakes. Some of them represent scandalous misconduct, but 47% of the cases involve these kinds of mistakes. Now, here was something wrong in a very, very different way. These errors were not committed by lay people. These were errors committed by scientists and forensic examiners and expert witnesses whose judgments were always presumed to be objective and accurate and not subject to bias, and I've heard them proclaim so myself in the last couple of years. In 2009, many of you are aware that the National Academy of Sciences wrote a rather scathing critique of the forensic sciences. The committee looked at a gamut of forensic sciences, including fingerprints and firearms and bite marks and hair and blood stain patterns, fire and explosive and DNA and fibers and whatnot. And they concluded that there were problems and that there was variability and that there was, first and foremost, an utter lack of necessary research. I have become more acutely aware of this problem in some of my own work, looking at confessions. All of this has become very obvious to me in cases where individuals who had confessed not only were tried on the basis of those confessions, but they were tried on the basis of the fact that those confessors were later erroneously identified as the source of a hair or a bite mark or some other form of forensic evidence. And in fact, when my colleagues and I looked through the Innocence Project database, we found that 2/3 of false confession cases also had forensic science errors in evidence, and invariably the forensic science error followed the confession. So over the years, this creeping realization that something is terribly wrong in the crime labs of America has led me to wonder about the psychology of the forensic sciences. And I am by no means the first. If you do an exploratory search of the literature, you'd see, first of all, that it taps into some very, very basic psychology, some basic psychology that brings us back to the very early days of the 20th century. You would also see more recently some very important writings from psychologists, APLS psychologists, such as Bill Thompson and Michael Sachs, both of whom I see are here today, and hi guys. And Simon Cole and Michael Reisinger and Jonathan Kohler. They have written extensively about some of the problems in important theoretical ways, and they've talked about the necessary procedural reforms. But when you look at that literature and you ask yourself the question, has anybody actually studied the forensic science experts? Well, that leads you to Itiel Dror. Itiel has, over the years, done the kinds of research that NAS had called for. Let me give you a little bit of his background. In 1994, he got a PhD at Harvard in cognitive neuroscience. He has gone on to publish a number of important, in fact, I would use the word devastating, research papers demonstrating in a nutshell that the same biases that afflict the ordinary person also can afflict the forensic scientist, working in a world where the stakes couldn't be higher. They are not immune to those biases. Itiel has come to this conclusion by studying professionals themselves, latent fingerprint experts, DNA experts, medical surgeons, forensic anthropologists, And what I've got listed here are just a handful of his articles that are some of my favorites. In my view, the study of the forensic sciences is destined to become a very significant wave of research that applies the psychology and law that we do here at APLS to the betterment of justice. I am, I think, as you all know, a fan of APLS. I am also a big fan of Itiel Dror's work. I know that this is his first APLS meeting. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to each other. Please give a warm welcome to Itiel Dror.
I assume my microphone is on and you can hear me? Thank you, Saul Cassin, for your kind introduction. There's a lot to talk about and very little time, so I put a lot of the information on the World Wide Web. I put the address there, and I'm not sure we're going to have any time for questions, so if you have any questions later, you're more than welcome to drop me an email, or if you want a copy of the presentation, I'm happy to send it to you. Do people in the back want to come and sit down? I'm happy to stop. No, you're happy in the back. Okay. Before I start, I just want to thank the organizers of the conference, the leadership in APLS to bring me here, and especially to Nancy, who dealt with me directly in a lot of emails. So I want to thank Nancy and everybody else for the efforts to bring me here. So I'm going to talk about the psychology and impartiality of forensic expert decision-making when justice is not blind. We all know that justice needs to be blind. I don't need to talk to the audience about it because I love the logo of APLS is the scale of justice. The problem is from time to time that the Lady of Justice may intentionally have a peek of what's going on. And sometimes it's not intentional. Perhaps the blinds are not fit for purpose and are not strong enough. So I'm focusing on the experts, not the experts in the courtroom, how persuasive they are, but the experts doing scientific assessment in the laboratory. So we need to understand and talk perhaps a bit about the courts. The courts have a very difficult task. I certainly would not want to do it. They need to make decisions based on partial information. As a scientist, if I don't have enough information, I collect more data. And if I'm not ready, I don't make a decision. I'm not forced at a certain time to make a decision on partial data. And in the court, they have to make a decision on partial data, and they make very important decisions. Now, what do they base their decisions on? Whether they believe the suspect, their assessment of the detective, the lineup procedures, witnesses' false memory, witnesses' credibility, how persuasive the lawyers are in presenting or questioning evidence. But as you all know, these are very problematic. Not do you know, but the audience here are the people who have shown it time and time again that all these areas are extremely problematic. And the court bases their decision on that. A very difficult task, and it is questionable. Not only you have to make a decision and on partial information, but it's questionable. And we have here, for example, in the audience today, the Honorable Superior Court Judge Christopher Ploud in the first row, and I wouldn't want your job. It's too difficult. It's being a judge in a Superior Court in California or making a judge where you have to make decisions, and very difficult ones. So it's a very difficult job. So we get a frowny face. This is all problematic. However, do not despair. You know, it's not all that bad because we have number 5 are the experts. The experts are going to save the day. They're going to save all the problems in the court system. Objective, independent, impartial people who bring science and help the court make the decisions with all the problems that we have seen. So they provide independent view to the court, impartial in analysis, often use instrumentation and objective judgments, rely on scientific approaches, the latest technology, and help the court administer justice. They communicate to the court accurately and fairly and are very important to the court. And this is all great stuff. And no wonder, and indeed, the court loves experts because they have a difficult task. They don't want to send innocent people to jail. They don't want to free out guilty people, and it's partial information, it's questionable, they have to make a decision, and suddenly an objective scientific expert comes and gives information, very powerful, and they rely on them. And as technology and science advances, there's more that experts can offer the court. So all of this is great stuff, but there is one problem, one obstacle in the way of achieving that, and this is a problem. Experts have that too. I used to carry a brain with me, but with security in airport, I don't do that anymore. So we have to have a diagram. Even the experts deceive and misguide the court. They come to the court and present themselves as impartial, scientific, and even if the courts believe this misrepresentation, it's hard to believe in the United States or in the US that fingerprint examiners until recently will appear in court in Dolbert hearings, whether it's a scientific domain, and testify in court that they are totally objective. They're not affected by context. They have zero error rate, and I quote, they are infallible. And that's what they said to the courts, and the courts took it on board and accepted. And we're talking about sending people to jail, and in the United States, some states have the death penalty, and the courts have adopted it. They present themselves as court, and it's our job to fix it. And the audience here, because we have neglected, we ourselves have not questioned the experts that will do scientific work in the lab. We've accepted that that is good, and we've shown that eyewitnesses are not reliable, lineups are not reliable, but have not really looked at the actual experts working in the scientific lab. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to show you some quite bad, disturbing stuff. It's going to be hard to believe some of it. And not only academic, but things that happen in the real world of the criminal justice system in the United States. I can show you the same from Australia, Finland, UK, Netherlands. I'm showing the US because I'm in the US. And wherever I go to Australia, they say, oh, the Americans, you know, the cowboys. You know, I say in America, the British, you say. So I'll show you the local things, but it's the same in every country. We have serious problems, but there is some good news. First of all, it's not intentional. I'm not accusing experts of intentionally being biased. We're talking about competent, hardworking, and motivated experts. Two, there are solutions, practical solutions, and these are actually taking place and are starting to be implemented, and I'll talk about that later and ask for your help so you can join the effort in moving this domain forward. I did put that it's not an ethical and motivational problem as something good, but in fact, I think it's something bad, because if we had corrupt forensic examiners, they're relatively easy to find. There are going to be a few of them. We find them and we deal with them. The problem is that the hardworking, honest examiners make the bias, and that is a much more bigger problem and also interesting to us as a researcher because it raises theoretical issues. It's not ethical issues. And it happens. In Arizona, a number of fingerprint examiners wanted a promotion. So they intentionally fabricated fingerprints of homeless people in a crime scene, in a murder scene, to get a promotion. Easy to find, easy to deal, and it's not interesting from a psychological perspective. But we're talking about the hardworking, honest examiners who do the job. So what are we talking about? There's a lot of information in an investigation, too much for the system to take on board. It's a cognitive load, first of all. So there's a face between the coffee beans. Can you see the face between the coffee bean? It's very hard to see it. It's on the bottom left. Just too much information. So they don't always see all the information in the investigation. And it's not only a matter of cognitive load. Count how many Fs you can see here. Not a lot of letters. Okay, pick up your hand if you see 3 Fs. Half of the people see 3 Fs, some will see more. There are 6. Let me show you the 6 Fs. Most will see 4, 5, and 3. Everybody sees the 3 here, but there's also 3 of. Ah. Are you blind? Now, the fact that you don't, it's not that you don't see, it's selective attention because you're experts in reading. And when you start reading, you read every letter and every word. But as you read more and more, your brain knows that that doesn't carry any information, and you have selective attention. This is the paradox of human expertise, why experts get it wrong. It's a trade-off. The underpinning of expertise, chunking, schemas, top-down processing, things I don't need to talk to you about, have a trade-off that are usually very effective, but can cause you to miss information and be not very good. The same thing when you have ambiguous information in the middle. If it's presented within other letters, A and C, people will interpret it as a B. If it's only presented within 12 and 14, people see it as 13. It's ambiguous. And in the crime scene, the criminals are not always polite and considerate and leave very clear evidence. So a lot of the time, the evidence requires interpretation, extrapolation, and things of that sort. And it's not only the perceptual context, but motivation. So even if you have an ambiguous thing with other contexts, there is a lot of phenomena of motivated perception that takes place. If we move to the forensic domain, and I can show you 2 faces and ask you to rank how similar they are, and I don't care how you do it, and give you a scale of 1 to 7. What is interesting is when we do that, and we tell some of the people on some of the pairs that they're related. So it's a mother and her daughter, or 2 brothers, and sometimes we say they're total strangers. Now, whether they're genetically related or not doesn't change the faces, right? But of course, it changes the judgment of how similar the faces are. Like father, like son, perceived resemblance, and the belief in genetic relatedness. So when you believe they're genetically related, you see the similarities and rank them as more similar when you believe they are total strange faces. Then it gets more interesting in skeleton remain. In the first piece of research we did, we provided a partial skeleton, like often happens in a crime scene or not a crime scene, and forensic experts had to assess whether the person died from a trauma or not. Very difficult judgment, and a bone fragment. And we found that what they say depends in their state of mind. If before they see the fragment, we give them one story, they say the person died from a trauma. We give them a different context of irrelevant information, and they come with the idea they know trauma. We said we'll do it easy. We'll give them a full skeleton and ask them to say if it's a female or a male. The age, the race, very basic stuff, a full intact skeleton with the pelvis. And they had a context that it's a male or a female before they went in. So they get a file. In one time, the skeleton belonged to Rachel Smith, and now it's the time to David Smith. Or now they have to dig out the skeleton. We're putting some clothes on them. So there may be women's clothes and a bra on some of the skeletons, and the other skeleton will have men's clothes. So they come with a mindset, but then they look at the skeleton, and we ask them, based on the skeleton, is this a male or a female skeleton? In this case, it's a female skeleton. They get a context that it's a female. They all say it's a female. But if they come, before they look at the skeleton, with a mindset that it's not a female, it drops to 38%. Cognitive bias in forensic anthropology. Then we look at fingerprints, which is the most used and longest used forensic domain. What happens when they look at the same fingerprint in different contexts? The person confessed to the crime, somebody else, they were identified, what the detective thinks the nature of the crime. So when I started with this, people, the forensic fingerprint people said we're totally objective. We're not going to be affected by that. So I decided to go the extra mile and went back into real criminal cases where a fingerprint expert went to court and said, this is an identification. And they don't even say identification, so you understand who you're dealing with. They say we individualize. What does that mean? That this person is the only person on the planet who could have left a fingerprint. And me being a bit facetious and cheeky, I say, what about people who died, who ever lived on the planet? They say, no, it couldn't belong to any of them. And then I say, what about the future? Can there any time in the future? You're laughing, but they would say, could never. No one's ever on the planet, nobody who's lived and will ever live can have left that fingerprint. So what I did, I took those strong judgments and gave 4 or 5 years later, it's from a criminal case from a few years ago, the same pair of fingerprints to the same examiner without their knowledge in a fabricated case, giving them a context that it's not that person. 80% said it's not a match. On the same fingerprint of the same examiner. It didn't make me very popular with the fingerprint community. And we have paper on contextual information renders experts vulnerable to making erroneous identifications. DNA, we're talking about mixture DNA, which is the same story, and we have a paper, Subjectivity and Bias in Forensic DNA Mixture. I won't go into the detail, but the same with DNA mixture interpretation. When something requires subjectivity and interpretation, then you're opening the door to being influenced by information that is not relevant. If you have 100% objectivity, it's all quantification and instrumentation, then it's not a problem. But the reality is that the forensic examiners are involved in most of the domains and in a very difficult way. So when they compare two handwritings, when they compare two bullets, when they compare two handwritings or fingerprints, they look at them, forget what you see on CSI, I'm telling you what really happens. The fingerprint, like the hand signature, like the bullet, are never identical. If they're exactly identical, we wouldn't need expert. Identical, it's a match. Not identical, it's not. They're similar, but sometimes two different people can have a similar fingerprints or similar handwriting, like faces. So what the experts do, they look at the two, the one from the crime scene and the suspect, and decide, are they similar enough to conclude that they come from the same source? What is similar enough? Nobody can tell you. Don't believe me, ask any forensic examiner. It's not written in any textbook. They can't articulate it. It's in the eye of the beholder. I'm not saying they can't do a good job. They're quite good at it. But when it's in the eye of the beholder, we need to make sure they're only looking at the handwriting or the bullet or the fingerprint and not influenced by all that other information. And you all got in the registration, so I don't want to go into detail, a paper with Saul Kassin and Jeff Kukuka on the forensic confirmation bias, where we summarize a lot of the literature. This is in the Journal of Applied Research in Memory and Cognition, and in the target article. So we got commentary from academics and practitioners. I'll mention a few of them later, attacking the different notions, and that is very interesting and insightful. So the forensic examiner, the scientific, objective, impartial forensic examiner working in the lab, has a lot of things they're working on that they take into account that they need to do their job. And Bob Rosenthal and I have a paper where we try to meta-analytically take all the studies and quantify how reliable and how biasable they are in doing forensic evidence. Now, I told you I'm going to talk to you about solutions that are taking place and are being implemented. So the United States have taken quite a lot of action, and the NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, has, in the last 6 months, has taken over all the forensic domains to try to put the house in order. So they have 24 committees on every forensic domain, but what has been a big, big success, they have formed a resource group on the psychology, on the human factors. And I chair that group. Bill Thompson, over here, if he picks his hand, is my vice chair. Chris Meisner is over there. He's the executive secretary. And Erin Morris is a member here. And we have the task to work with all the forensic domain, and we're building task forces. But we need psychologists like you, and we can appoint affiliates. So if any one of you wants to be affiliated and to help looking at the human factor issues, please talk to Chris or Bill or Erin or myself after the meeting, and you can be formally associated as affiliates to the human factor group in setting the standards. We're going to go every standard they want to set in DNA, in fingerprint, in bite mark. Have you looked on the psychology issue that may affect the experts, and force them to take it, encourage and work with them, whichever term you want to use, to take these issues on board. The Department of Justice has set up a National Commission on Forensic Science, and Chris, Bill, and I are members on that human factor committee of the National Commission on Forensic Science. The American Association for the Advancement of Science has now, very prestigious, they publish Nature or Science, has taken it on board, the forensic issue, and I sit on the scientific advisory group, and they're looking at every forensic domain about the research. And I managed to persuade them that in every group of the American Association for Advancement of Science, when they look at the literature, they need a psychologist. And now they want me to name psychologists. So come and talk to me if you want to be involved, because they're asking for people like you who can come and look at the literature and bring the psychological issues, because now they understand that it's relevant to them. And it's a great area of research, and there's a lot of money in this area with nobody claiming it. NSF has sent a letter, we want to fund this area. NIJ, NIST, private foundations are looking for people to do research on the psychology of experts in forensic science. So if you want to do interesting research, get funded, and make a change, I really invite you to do research in this domain. And there's a lot of different aspects that you can think about. One of the things that we're working as a human factor group with them is asking what information is relevant. What do they need to do their task? What is relevant? Because we want to understand where irrelevant influences, where do the biases come to them, and it's important so we find ways to avoid the bias, or we can't avoid it. So in a paper with Bill Thompson, again, Chris Meisner, and a few others, we're trying to have a taxonomy of different sources of information that they do not need but can bias them. So we can start at the bottom with the trace evidence, the actual evidence. In some forensic domains, it's irrelevant, the crime, and we can isolate it. A fingerprint, when you're comparing two fingerprints, you do not need to know the crime. You don't need to know the background story. You're comparing two fingerprints. In other domains, it's a bit more difficult. If you're comparing handwriting and you're reading the letter, you know what the letter is about. If you're comparing voices, you hear the screaming, you hear the intonation. Bite marks, I'm going to show a few disturbing pictures. If you don't want to see bite marks on babies, don't look. And you can have bite marks that you can see, and I'm not showing you the worst pictures, and this is very hard. This is when the context, they don't need to know that the bite is off, a woman's breast and see all the blood and the baby, but it's in the evidence, in the actual evidence they need to look at, and it's a bit challenging to take the context out. Then we have the reference material. They need to do a comparison between the evidence in the crime scene and the suspect. This is the reference material. And an example would be in fingerprints. I mentioned they have a suspect and they will have a fingerprint from the crime scene. This is from a serial murderer who Friday night would follow young blonde ladies, and they would go on a bus, and he would drive behind the bus. They'd get off the bus, he'd park their car, and he comes from behind them and hits them on the head with a baseball bat or a hammer, kills them, doesn't rape them, doesn't take their money. Just Friday night, this guy does this stuff for entertainment, and there is a picture of the car of the murderer. And if you look at the license plate, this is the actual evidence, it comes to court. And the forensic examiner identifies the registration plate. Now, I try to stay away from court, but I was involved in this case. And when you look at the evidence, you find it's a high profile, everyone talking about it, and they don't come to the expert and say, look at this, what is the registration plate? You know, I can't make sense of it, but I'm not a forensic examiner. But what they do, and it's in writing, the detective said, I know who did it. It's Levi Belfield. We have lots of evidence. Here is his registration number. Can you see it? So they're working not from the evidence to the suspect, from the suspect to evidence. We try to work from data to the theory, right? Data undermines theory. You don't work from the theory, from the data, and throw away the data when it doesn't fit our theory. So they do it like the Romans did archery, bow and arrow, hit the tree, and then they draw the target. Always bullseye. Again, unintentionally. And remember that the criteria to match is very subjective. Are the two sufficiently similar? Here I see in the report that the detective says, here is the license plate of Levi Belfield. Do you see it? And they see it. It gets more interesting, given that I'm an academic geek. I look at the file very carefully, and I find that one of the examiners, they showed it to him before they had a suspect. And I read his report. And he said in his report, are you crazy? Are you making fun of me to do this? And not only he writes it, he cites scientific papers saying that to identify characters, you need a minimal of 9 rows of pixels, and here there's only 7. And then it gets cross-examined in court, and it's very interesting to see the flexibility of the human mind. He doesn't even say, I have a new version of Adobe or a better monitor. He explains away how he said it and how it's really the registration plate. So this is interesting reference materials. And again, Bill Thompson, Chris Meisner, myself, and a few other people are working on a linear sequential unmasking process where you cannot blind examiners to the information. They have to see the fingerprint of the suspect, but not initially. We want them, first of all, to look at the fingerprint from the crime scene, document it, the DNA from the crime scene, and after they do it independently, then they can see that of the suspect. They need to see the suspect at some stage, but if we cannot blind them to the information, to sequence the order of seeing information to minimize the bias. So this is a few words on reference materials. Then the case information is the next level I want to talk about. And this is, again, a US case where I blacked the name of the county and the detective because I'm not here to embarrass. Every time I show somebody, they say, oh, this is a bad country, a bad detective, a bad forensic examiner. So I took their name off. So this is first of all, if you look on the top right, it's homicide. So that the fingerprint examiner needs to know it's homicide, irrelevant. Then the victim is white and the suspect is black. Why do they need to know that? Well, maybe they do. I'm not a fingerprint examiner, but when I ask every fingerprint examiner, they say it doesn't change the fingerprint. Race and fingerprint are not, there's nothing to do with one another. So why do they need to know it? But then it gets better. If you look at the bottom, I'm going to zoom in, and this is what's given in writing in a formal request. I'm not talking about what happens informally when they go in the evenings to the barbecue, gestures, nonverbal communication. This is in writing. The detective says to the fingerprint examiner, the above listed suspect is the person who pulled the trigger. Make every effort to place him in the truck. If it was England, they'd say please, but I guess it's an American request. And not only that, they tell the fingerprint examiner the one suspect riding the truck was too drunk to make an identification. It's up to you. This black guy murdered a white guy. I have no witnesses. He pulled the trigger. Make every effort. This is not relevant. Shouldn't be relevant. But the fingerprint examiners are objective. They're impartial. It doesn't affect them. Remember, they are not affected. So when I published my first papers, look what they wrote back to me, and I'm not talking about the hate email. I'm not talking the insults on the chat boards. I'm talking what they published in a letter to the editor in a journal, in the professional, and not a fingerprint examiner. The chairman of the International Fingerprint Society, what does he have to say when I'm saying they're not objective, when I'm giving the same fingerprint to the same examiner, 80% change their mind? He says any fingerprint examiner who is affected by context should work in Disneyland. That's arrogance because the court adopts them, the jury CCSI believe everything they said. We have not done research to show otherwise. So they've gone very high on a pedestal. Recently, I'm really trying to engage the community. I'm an American, I lived in the US, but now I've been in England for a long time, so it's affected me. And the version you see is more polite than I used to be. Still not polite, but it's better than I used to be. So I'm talking to the executive director of the Crime Scene Association, and he writes to me, I have read the document in your link. You imply in the document that many are persuaded by outside and internal influences, and in essence, out to get the bad guy. In my 43 years of working, I have not witnessed the shortcomings you talk about. I don't see it, doesn't exist. And of course, and yes, I do take pride in putting the bad people away. So I write to him, really making an effort, I must disagree with you. I do not say or mean to say that they have an attitude, but the context that they are given, one that they do not need irrelevant information, unintentionally affects cognitive processing. If this is not enough, I go an extra mile. I don't know what happened to me that day. I say to him, I think I can convince you. And not only convince you, show you the potential problems, and how to solve them. And the plan D, not plan B, may be a good topic to discuss and debate. Bring me to your conference and let's debate it. What does he say to me? There is no debate, nothing to talk about. Once I have 30 years of experience working with police agencies, maybe I'll have the background to talk to them, and perhaps if I handled a few child homicide, you might feel what we feel. So you see what we're dealing with here in the forensic community, even though things have changed and improved quite a lot. So I told you there's been commentary on the Target article that you all got. And one of the commentary, again, a practitioner who was the chair of SWIGFAST Scientific Working Group, the highest group until NIST took over, that puts guidelines on how to look at fingerprints. And he reads a paper that Sal, Jeff, and I wrote, and he says the following, and I quote, examiners want to read investigative report or talk to investigators before or while they examine the case. So it's after they make a decision, we don't care. And he says perhaps such interest merely provides some personal satisfaction. They can enjoy their job. They enjoy it when they know the juicy details, not after they make the decision. And of course, he says, without actually altering their judgment, it doesn't affect them because they're objective and they can know all the details and feel what we feel because it's a child homicide, but still, it doesn't affect their subjective judgment. And then, of course, he said, our job is boring. Admittedly, many tasks performed by forensic examiner are tedious, mundane, and to many people, just not interesting enough to do it. So I don't want to look at the fingerprint for hours unless you tell me and I talk to the detective and the family and the victim. I'm motivated to look at it. We're laughing, and I don't mind to be entertaining, but these people are going to court and sending people to jail. People are being executed on this kind of evidence, and the court have adopted them. I mentioned that fingerprint examiners, and I'm picking on fingerprints because they're so good. If I show problems with fingerprints, you can be sure with bite mark and handwriting. The other domains are even worse. They rely more on subjectivity, more interpretation. So fingerprint is a really good domain. Not only when they compare the latent print from the crime scene and the suspect and decide that they're sufficiently similar to draw the conclusion of individualization, even when they look at the evidence, there are some serious problems. So I'm taking a group of latent prints from crime scene, and I give it to different examiners and want them to say what they see, to count the characteristics, the minutiae. This is what they make the decision basically about how the fingerprint separates and different characteristics. They're called minutiae. And they say to me, we'll all come with the same number. This is the evidence in isolation without even a target of a suspect. And here is data. 10 examiners, 10 prints, all over the place. How many minutiae they see from, and you can see the mean, max, range, and standard deviation, how many characteristics. The same fingerprint, one sees 3, one sees 10, one sees 20. Okay, let's be reasonable. Different people have different glasses, they have different training, they have different individual differences. So I went to the next step. I said, I'm going to give the same print to the same examiner 6 months apart. Not doing a comparison and deciding if they match or not. Just looking at the print, what do you see? So we have time 1 and time 2. And to make it more palatable for cognitive load, I'll subtract time 1 from time 2. And there are some zeros, but it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Differences of the same examiner looking at the same latent print, what they see before the comparison. And this shows you the degrees of freedom they have in their perception and judgment. And when you have so many degrees of freedom, you better isolate yourself from all the irrelevant things that cause you to feel strongly about the case. If there's no degrees of freedom, it doesn't matter. This opens the vulnerability to what I call the bias danger zone. And again, I have the paper on my website looking at inter and intra-expert consistency. And in the paper, we also look how what they see in the crime scene depends on the suspect. If they see them at the same time, you get more and more effects. So that's a few words on case information. Now we'll move to base rate. And you can see what I have to tell you is quite disturbing because there's so many. It's not one source of bias. It's from everywhere, affecting them from so many different directions. So base rate, I'm sure you're all very familiar. It's very well established. People, experts more, learn from experience. If you don't learn from experience, you're an idiot, right? Nietzsche said that sheep are not very smart. In his book, History of Time, he said sheep wake up in the morning, they go to the field, they go here, they don't find any food. They go here, they don't find any food. They go here, they find food. The next morning, they do exactly the same. They go here, they don't find any food. They find here, and they go. I don't know enough about sheep to make a judgment, but Nietzsche said they don't learn from experience. But base rate, we learn from experience, and we have examples in the medical domain. I do a lot of work in the medical domain. Then in expert decision-making, in critical care unit, in intensive care units, people are connected to monitors that go off if the measurement of the blood pressure or the breathing is off and the person is supposedly dying. Intensive care unit, about half the people survive, half the people die. The first day on the job, the nurse, the doctor, it goes beep, 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 and they have to go physically to reset it. They stop eating, they stop watching American Idol or whatever is on TV. They run to the patient. They check the patient very carefully. Everything is fine. They reset it. And then again, they're going to take a bite of the donut. No, again. And they run again and again every day. And what do they find? They go off all the time false alarms. So they learn and they ignore it. So if you've had the pleasure of being in an intensive care unit or visiting someone, you will see they come, they press a reset, and they don't look at the patient. It makes the patient and the family very nervous because there's all these lights and emergency code blue going on, and they say, don't worry about it. The same thing with airport security. They watch an X-ray, you check your suitcase, and they train them, they show them pictures of dead women and children, and say, you will be responsible if you're texting, or 1 second you're not looking at the X-ray. So they come to the airport, and they look. No bomb, no bomb, no bomb. 8 hours. And they come tomorrow, and they look. And they'll do it for 20 years. How many bombs are they going to find? None. 6 million people fly every day. How many bombs did they find yesterday? None. Today, I predict they won't find any bomb again. So people learn that, and even if they're motivated to look, the brain does not engage because we're affective, like the letter F. We know of a that doesn't carry information. We offer students £1 for every F they see. In England, you can drink from 18. The students go to a happy hour, have 2 beers on £1, $1.70, but still they don't see the 6 Fs. The brain automatically does selective attention. So now let's talk about the forensic domain, AFIS, automated fingerprint identification systems. So right now, in the olden days, there was a fingerprint from the crime scene, and if the police didn't have a suspect, they would look at previous suspects, 1,000, 500, for hours. Now we have databases, so it goes into this automated fingerprint identification that looks at millions of fingerprints. The FBI has like 70 million people on the database. Each one has 10 fingers. It goes through all the database very quickly, but it cannot decide if there's a match or not. That the computers cannot do. They can do it if you go to the airport or to a secure location and you give all 10 fingers in a controlled environment, then they can do it most of the time. But the crime scene, you don't have nice fingerprints. You have latent, they're on noise, they're on top of one another, they're distorted. And the computer, all the computer can do is provide a list of candidates that are more likely to be a match, and you need the human examiner. Again, CSI TV, they put it in, the computer says who it is. That is not the reality of forensic science. Now, the technology, AFIS, provides a ranked list. How many candidates varies? San Diego police, it's a list of 20. LAPD, it's 50. It varies how long the list is, but on the list, it puts it on the top, the most likely candidate, and then it goes down. And the vast majority of hits are on the top of the list, because these systems are very good. They cost tens of millions of dollars, they're very expensive. And if you find a hit, usually about 20% of the time they find a hit, 80% there's no hit at all. But if there is a hit, it's 98, 95% on the top. So I said to them, this is clear and consistent base rate. This is something very clear. You're smart, you're busy, and your brain takes it on board. And again, I did not receive a very welcome reception from them. They said, our protocol, we look at every fingerprint on the list, not only the one on the top, but we look at the second and third and each item. That's what we do. How dare you accuse us of? So I said to them, I think you look at it differently. And we did research. And what we did, we collected over 50,000 AFIS decisions. If they know it's a research, okay, I speed, but not when I'm taking a driving test or the police officer with a radar. So I test examiners doing casework, or they think they're doing casework. They don't know it's part of research. And they're doing AFIS decisions. And the first thing we did, we measured how much time. Nobody's ever collected response time. They just decide to match and not match. And as they go down the list, they spend less time on the comparison. Now, it could be they spend less time because the fingerprints look more different. On the top of the list, it looks very similar. They need a lot of time to look at it. So what we did, we took the item on the top of the list and gave it to some examiners at number 2, at number 7, at number 9. So there were different examiners who were comparing both prints. When they print from the top of the list, they spend a lot of time. As it goes down the list, they spend less time on it. Now, does that affect accuracy? We wanted to know. So what we did, we intercepted again the APHIS list as it comes from the computer to the examiner, and we put a match. So there was a match. Sometimes we put a match on the top of the list, sometimes lower down the list. And what do we find? It's published data. They're more likely to miss an identification when it appears further down the list. So when it is a match, they almost never miss it when it's number 1, and that's where they expect to find it. But if you put the same print further down the list, they're going to miss it, not all the time, but 27% of the time. Huge amount, over a quarter. And when they make a wrong identification, rarely they make a wrong identification, but when they do, the false positive, it's only when it's on the top of the list. They're almost never going to make an identification decision on an item further down. When they don't expect it, they're more likely to make it when it appears on the top of the list. So you can see that even in APHIS, in technology, because they all say technology is going to solve the problem, technology doesn't solve the problem. It changes the kind of biases that we find. Can we solve the problem? Yes, quite easy. First of all, you can motivate them, give them a prize. $10,000 to every examiner who finds an identification on an APHIS list below number 10. It's going to work. Number 2, you can force them cognitively. What do they do in the airport security? It's unclassified information. You can go to the TSA website. There's a system called TIP, Threat Image Projection. What happens? The computer, X-ray, projects a bomb from time to time. And if the examiner sitting there at the airport doesn't see it, the cell phone of the supervisor rings, and he comes to him and says, everything okay? Yeah, great. Well, roll back. He says, what do you call this? Oh, my God, it's a bomb. Yes. I'm going to test you from time to time. Now, you don't need many examples like this to break the base rate expectation. You tell them from time to time, I'm going to have a bomb. Strike 1. If you miss another one, I'm going to come again. I'm not going to be as friendly. And that breaks the base rate expectation. So the same here, you can tell them not to trap them. From now on, from time to time, you're going to get an APHIS list, and we're going to take the top item and we're going to put it lower down the list when it's a match. And if you don't find it, you're going to have to come and talk to me. This is the quality control. I went, and to show you a bit of the mentality, I went to a conference a few years ago, and the quality control manager of the FBI was giving a talk, and she talked about verification. They verify their decisions. The same cognitive problem. So when they make an identification, it goes to a second examiner. So she gives a talk, and they only verify IDs. So she finishes the talk, being the pain that I am, my hand is up first. So how many did you verify last year? 4,822 identifications. How many did you not verify? 0. And the year before, we did 6,200. How many did you not verify? 0. So I smile. And she's not going to take any bullshit from me. So she says, why are you smiling, Dr. Dror? I said, what does it mean? How do you interpret this data? She says, it means my examiners are doing a damn good job in what they're doing. So I smile even more. And she says, you don't think so? I said, I don't think yes, and I don't think no. You have no data. What I want you to do is every year take 10 fingerprints that are not identical but look similar, put it to verify. And if you come to me next year and say they verified 5,621 except the 10 that were not real identification, then you're absolutely right. But if you don't tell your examiners, I'm willing to bet, I said to her, that they'll verify them. And if you tell them you're going to do it, I think they will catch all the 10 that are not ident, but probably not verify another 20 that every year didn't have before. Well, they didn't take the challenge yet, but hopefully they will. But this is kind of a cognitive solution. And the easy one is to randomize. Give the examiner the list of candidates, 20, and randomize the order. These are solutions that are good, but are academic and unuseful and not practical. There's a lot of pressure on the forensic community, financial cuts, and why they're not practical, because the minute we're going to motivate people or use some kind of tip system or randomize, if they took 1 hour to go on the list, now they're going to take 2 hours. First of all, it means they didn't do it properly the first time, but they don't have the time. So a practical solution is cut the length of the list. Why do you have 20 when 98% you're going to find it in the first 5 places? Give them 5 and randomize it. And in special cases, you have some terrorist or pedophile or whatever, then you can have a list of 50 and randomize it, and nobody complains on the time you spend. And that is a practical solution. And again, this is just an example of the practical solutions that we're developing for standards in the human factor groups, and we want your help in doing that, and you can come and talk to Erin, Bill, Chris, or myself later. And again, we have some papers on practical solutions to cognitive and human factor issues. The last level is our organizational and cultural factors. And one of the biggest problems in the United States, also in the UK, is the adversarial system. And people are not moving away. Poland is moving now to the adversarial system. And I'm not going to get into general issues of the adversarial system, but they are hired, and there's a great paper by Dan Mary and Marcus Boccassini, where they look at it when they give the same evidence. They hire over 100 experts and give them the same evidence. They don't manipulate if the suspect is black and white and whether it's a child homicide. They give the same evidence, except they tell half of them we are from the prosecution, and they tell half of them we are from the defense. And they find a huge effect. In 3 out of the 4 cases they gave the examiners, the fact that the examiner believed they work for the prosecution or for the defense, they call it adversarial allegiance. And that relates to examples of the cultural factors. And many experts, I know you're experts in court, but many experts, I work with a lot of the forensic experts, many of them are sworn police officers. They carry a badge and a gun, and I go in the evening to the bar with them, and they start telling me all the macho stories about the bad guys they're catching. They're very much in a police mentality, many of the forensic domain. They're sworn officers. They're part of a team that they're working. And this relates to some of the organizational and cultural factors. And we're working on all of this to try to understand all the different factors that affect the forensic examiner doing scientific laboratory work, what they need, what they don't need. Now, the last topic I'm going to talk about and try to leave some time for question 2 is a move from the individual domain to contamination. There are 2 issues here. One issue is integration of different lines of evidence. And again, one of the commentaries to the Target article that you were given is by Steve Charman, and he talks a lot, and he's absolutely right that there's a lot of issues in the integration. How do you integrate different sources of information? Another one that Saul and I talk about is that the entire criminal justice judicial model does not work. What am I talking about? There's a fact finder, the detective, the jury, the judge, and they get a lot of information. The fingerprint examiners talk to them, DNA examiners, a whole range of forensic experts and experts who may not be in forensics. They have eyewitnesses provide information. They have suspects that confess to the crime. Other experts, a whole range of data comes in, and they put it all together and decide, the detective, do they think this person committed the crime, or the jury or the judge, is the person guilty or not. And this is the model we have. Some of it supposedly provides objective evidence, like the DNA and the fingerprint. And the eyewitnesses or the suspect, it's a very subjective judgment. I talk to detectives, and they say, before I interrogated or interviewed the suspect, I look in their eyes, and I can tell you if they're guilty or not. And maybe they do a good job. And the jury decision, this is your area of expertise. They're affected and do a lot of things that are not best. But, we're humans. We do the best we can. And this very weak, problematic model only works if there's independence, there's lack of contamination between the different lines of evidence. At least each line of evidence is no good, but at least there's something good about it. We want it independent. This is very basic issues. What happens when we start to get contamination? So, for example, the eyewitnesses, I remember the US Congress proudly saying, yes, there are forensic mistakes, but at least we didn't execute anyone innocent. And then the New Yorker came out with an article on the Willingham case, who was executed, an innocent man that was executed. So what happened in this case, in a nutshell, this guy comes home, his house is burning, and his three children, very young children, all die in the fire. The police investigates, they interview eyewitnesses, and said, what happened? And they said, what about the dad? How did he respond? Oh, the dad was really upset. He was crying. He wanted to run into the house to save the children, and the police officers had to physically restrain him from going into the house. And they said, did he behave in a way that you would behave if you saw your kids being barbecued alive? And they all said, yes, it was all, what you expect. Everything is fine until the forensic examiners, the fire investigators, go to the detective and say, this is not an accidental fire. This was arson. And the detective builds a whole story why the dad is a pedophile, and the kids were going to talk about it, and he decided to burn them. So they go back to the eyewitnesses, and the detective is doing their job. The forensic examiners told them it's an arson. They have a hypothesis, and they come and they say to the witnesses, I don't want you to change your story, but now I know it's an arson. Can you go back and think carefully about what happened with the dad? Was everything okay? And then they all slowly start changing this. You know what? He was overreacting. Oh, yeah, maybe it was a show. They all change their testimony. The person is convicted. The person is executed. But the punchline of the story is that fire investigators today all say it was not arson. It was accidental. At the time that this happened, the understanding of how fires expand, igniting materials, was not sophisticated, and now it's not disputed by fire investigation that this was no arson. This is an example how one can contaminate the evidence. And then they have eyewitnesses, so they go to the fingerprint examiner, the DNA examiner, and say, hey, we know the person did it, the person confessed to the crime, and influence all of them. And confessions, that Sal talks about, happens a lot. And in the US, they're trained to do it. In England, you're not allowed, it's illegal to do what police officers are not only allowed, but are trained to do. Here they're trained and encouraged to pretend they have evidence they don't actually have. They come and say to you, oh, it's not a serious crime. I understand, I'd kill him too, if he did this to my daughter. Absolutely. And they have these mechanisms to cause people to confess. And they believe that people are guilty. But let's talk about the United States. Dwayne Jackson was identified incorrectly by DNA. This is not disputed. Go to YouTube. The chief of police in Las Vegas and the head of the DNA lab on YouTube are saying, we made a mistake. We're sorry. There's an error in the DNA that we identified. But what is interesting is that Dwayne Jackson confessed to the crime. I said, why did you confess to a crime that you haven't committed? He said, they had DNA evidence against me. I was not going to confess when I didn't do it. But they said to me they're going to offer me a very good deal. 5 years in jail. I've been in jail for a year waiting for the trial. Good behavior, I'll be in 2 years. And I said, no, I'm going to stand. And my lawyer said to me, you're a brave man. You're going 20 years to jail, but you're a brave man. And the first year or two, your wife and your kids are visiting you. But in most cases, they get divorced after 4 or 5 years. In 7 years, your kids are going to call another man daddy. Is that what you want? And he confessed to the crime. And in the United States, how many cases are plea bargained here? 90, 95% are plea bargained. So it never gets to court. The forensic evidence is never questioned in the adversarial system. If it's questioned, the defense don't have the same resources, unless you're Michael Jackson or O.J. Simpson, I guess. But it doesn't even get to court with not equal expertise, because most of the cases are plea bargained. It goes to court and it's never questioned. And of course, it's not only the detective that influences, it's they talk to one another. They get the entire file. And of course, the fingerprint examiners, if they don't know everything, they're not interested enough to do their work, right? They need to enjoy their work, and it doesn't affect them. And you get a whole range here of what we call the bias snowball effect. So it starts, and you bias people, and you bias evidence, and the more evidence you bias, the more bias gets, and the stronger it is. And then it's very hard to exonerate people, because you're convicted based on fingerprint and DNA and your confession, and they find out that the DNA evidence or the witnesses or something is wrong. I said, we still are not going to exonerate the person, because when we pull this evidence out, there's still other evidence against this person. But there wouldn't be this other evidence initially, because it started by the biasing of the error, and then it expanded and expanded and so on and so forth. So these are some serious problems that exist, and an area that has been neglected. The courts have accepted it, and us as a community of psychology and law have not really paid attention to it. We looked at ID parades, false memories, jury deliberation, but we also accepted experts are not biased like eyewitnesses who are sincere. Experts, scientific experts, are causing big problems. I've shown it in face recognition, in face identification, in face comparison. The belief whether two people are the same picture with age differences, how similar faces are, depends with the bias you come in advance. Deciding if a skeleton is a male or female, quite simple decisions, are affected with a state of mind, your expectation, how you select information. And fingerprint experts, the objective domain, same experts on the same evidence. Luckily for me, there was a big case that showed it, because when there is a mistake, they try to brush it. Oh, it's a bad lab, it's a bad examiner. So the FBI made a huge erroneous identification. The FBI, the lab who is the best on the planet, the Madrid bombing, there was a big bombing in Madrid, hundreds died, thousands were injured, and they had a latent print on the bag. And they sent it to MI5 and the Mossad and the FBI, and the FBI made a match to Brendan Mayfield. Muslim guy, lawyer, defense terrorist, and on the watch list. So an FBI examiner looks at the print and identifies Brendan Mayfield and said, this is a match. I'm 100% sure I cannot be wrong. They give it to another FBI examiner. They look at it and say it's a match, 100% sure I can't be wrong. They give it to another, a third examiner, and they say exactly the same. They arrest Brendan Mayfield, they knock on his door at 2 in the morning, before he turns the lights, they're inside, they're arresting him. And he says, I haven't left the US in 20 years. They say, don't waste our time. We have fingerprint evidence, 3 examiners of the FBI independently with 100% confidence. They didn't say 99.999, 1 out of 10 million, 100%. Nobody else on the planet could have left a fingerprint, including those who died thousands of years, and including all of those that will live forever. He's the only one. It goes, he's not having a good day. You can laugh, but Brendan Mayfield is not very happy. It starts going to court, and in court, Brendan Mayfield says, with all due respect to the FBI, I want an examiner, because I know about adversarial allegiance. Dan, Mary, and Mark didn't have the paper yet, but I want one for my side. And the court says, fine. And the defense hires a fingerprint examiner. And that fingerprint examiner says, yes, it's 100% a match. So he's having a very bad day. Luckily for him, who knows what would have happened, the Spanish police called the FBI and said, we found the Madrid bomber, Dahoud. So what does the FBI say? Impossible. We have him. You Spanish don't know how to look at fingerprints. And they send 2 agents to Madrid to explain to them how to look at fingerprints. And they go to Spain, and they call back and home and says, we have a problem here. And I have to say, in respect to the FBI, after some excuses where we looked at compressed files sent over email, it took them a few weeks, a few months, and there was an investigation by the Office of the Inspector General found that it was erroneous identification and that confirmation bias was a contributor. And they've changed the processes. They have adopted in fingerprint a linear approach. They look at the latent print. They're not allowed to look at the suspect, and they go from the evidence to the suspect. It took them a few months to realize the mistake. In the UK, we have the same story, except they couldn't agree. It took 14 years in a judicial inquiry, and there's a bunch of examiners saying to me, this is a match to Shirley McKee. I'm 100% sure. And I have another bunch of examiners that it's not a match, I'm 100% sure. I say I'm not a fingerprint examiner, but that's not possible, right? Both of you can say you're 90% sure, but you cannot both be 100%. So we have this domain that we really need to think about. And it's not only fingerprints, DNA mixture, forensic anthropology, handwriting, firearms, blood splatter, and more domains. And hopefully, with your help, we will get proper research because the forensic examiners are trying to protect their area. They're doing research, they call it research, but it's to validate what they're doing. And if you want to see how they recruit their participants, I'll show you from the chat board. We are being attacked. We need to defend that we're not biased. I need people to participate in my study, and some of you, I'll tell you it's a murder case, and some I'll tell you it's a stolen bicycle, and I want to show that you're not affected by it. That's how they recruit the participant. I have it on the chat board. So we need real researchers like you to come into this domain, to help in the National Institute of Standards and Technology to set the standards, and to take the money that's been offered to research by NSF and NIJ. The forensic work is very interesting, with a lot of powers. We're trying to organize it, to think about it systematically, and to collect data. This is a psychology and impartiality of forensic expert decision-making when justice is not blind. Thank you very much. I believe we have 15 minutes for questions, and people who don't have time or are embarrassed are more than welcome to drop me an email later. So please, yes. I'm a bit jet lagged, so if you speak slowly, and you speak American English, which is making it more difficult.
I'll speak Canadian English.
Perfect.
Canadian English. So my question is there any research that looks at the effect of who hired the expert, whether it was prosecution, defense?
Yeah, I mentioned there is the paper by Dan Mary and Mark Bocaccini and a few others published recently when they hired 108 experts, I believe, or 104, and divided them and showed that the fact that you believe you're working for the defense or you believe you're working for the prosecution biases your decision-making, and they call it adversarial allegiancy. So there is research on that to look that the fact that you believe you're working for the defense or for the prosecution affects your interpretation. The same evidence, same context, exactly identical, doing measurements that are supposedly objective and reliable, whether you work for the defense or the prosecution, affected the results, yes. So we have this data. Yes, please. Or you can come to the microphone, or I can come to you, one of them.
One thing you discussed was some of the, to maybe put it, to understate it, resistance from the forensic community to some of these findings and some of these possible solutions. Are there any areas that you found in solutions where there's agreement between the practitioners and the scientists about things they can work on, or areas that, that the forensic community has been more open to adjusting their practices?
I've been asked many times to do it by domain or by country. First of all, I want to say, in recognition of the forensic community, and I take my hat off to them, in 10 years, they have changed a lot. Right now, there's a huge openness. It's unbelievable. Initially, even to collect data, I had to knock on 100 labs, beg them, threaten them to find one lab that would collaborate. Then half of them agreed. Now I get emails from lab. If you want participants, they initiate it. So there's a big change in that. Generally speaking, until now I talked science. Now I'm giving you my opinion, so take it with a grain of salt. DNA examiners are 10 steps ahead of every other forensic domain. They're educated in science. They have degrees. Many of them have PhDs. They have masters. They know. I went to a DNA conference 5 years ago. I received an okay reception. But you have to remember that in certain domains like fingerprints, especially the older generation, are police officers who were doing such a bad job down patrolling the streets. They said we have to put them in a desk job before they shoot somebody. And then they put them as fingerprint examiners. This is changing slowly. But right now, I would say most of the domains are very open. The medical examiners still have a bit of disagreement what is relevant and not relevant. They have what we can call the Sherlock Holmes syndrome. And people who may have seen Quincy MD, from 20 years ago on TV, where they don't understand their role as scientists. They see themselves as part of the investigative team and want to know more information. So we need to define what is relevant or not. And this is a battle, that Chris, Bill, Aaron, and I are fighting every day. And there's emails from this morning on this, and there is more resistance in the medical death investigation. But the other forensic domains now, I would say almost all of them are quite open. But they're still in a very difficult position because they live in the adversarial system. The adversarial system is not a scientific environment. It's anti-scientific. They say to me, if I admit a weakness, when I go to court, they're going to use it against me, whether I'm going for the prosecution or for the defense, are going to attack me. So it's very hard for them to admit their weakness or their vulnerabilities because they're working in the adversarial. So the adversarial system is a very big problem to do science within that environment.
Thank you.
I have to say, I think I'm no longer impartial. You've convinced me completely, but it was very interesting. I have a doctoral student who's, she has a JD and a master's in forensic biology, and she's very interested in these kinds of issues, and she's been studying the impact of the Melendez-Diaz decision, the U.S. Supreme Court decision that now requires forensic examiners to come to testify in court, and it's no longer you can just submit a report. So I'm wondering if you think the impact of that decision is going to increase this problem of confirmation bias or actually make it better?
Two comments. You said that now you know you're not objective, and we know, if we know we're alcoholic, that's half of the solution, admitting that we're alcoholics, right? So we can all, not you, but the forensic community, if we can, they all stand up and say, I'm biased, you know, my name is Itiel Dror and I'm biased, we'll be doing good. In terms of the accountability that we're talking where, so that is a great topic for research. I can theorize it's working both ways. One is you're accountable, so you take measures to be more objective. On the other hand, it may cause you to rationalize more and climb higher on the tree. So that is a very great topic for research, for your PhD students or anyone to look at those issues of whether you need to explain it in court or not in court. But when they go in court, they come from the prosecution or for the defense and part of the team and the team players, and they get paid by the prosecutors, by the defense, and that makes it very, very difficult for them to get into trouble. And I can tell you many stories in the US of how examiners are under pressure, and they tell me, and somebody's collected a survey, 70% of the forensic examiners say that sometimes before they look at the evidence, they know what they're expected to find. It's communicated to them. 70% before they look at it. So it's not looking at the data, it's all this contextual effects that we're working on.
To the extent that these effects are pure bias effects, that somebody has, the examiners have a law enforcement prosecution bias to find a match, it suggests that you should get more false negatives, or I guess more false positives, but also more true positives, which would be sort of keeping D prime constant. And I wonder if that's a pattern that you see in your results.
So you're raising another big challenge in the forensic community. Because they're educated, and this is a change in culture, which is extremely hard to achieve, they're educated that they never make mistakes. They only classify mistakes as false positives. So they're extremely conservative. And I can tell them, I can be a forensic examiner and never make a mistake, and never say a match, or just say inconclusive. So they are very, very conservative. They have very, very rare false positives, but a lot of false negatives or inconclusive. In my data, it's 27% versus 0.09 or something like that. So they're very conservative, and a lot of good evidence is thrown away. Now, some domain, like handwriting, they don't say a match or not a match. They have a scale. It varies from place to place, but usually it's a scale of 7. In fingerprint, it's a match, or it's inconclusive or not a match. And that forces them to extreme conservatism, and I think we lose a lot of evidence because they have this big deal. If you said inconclusive and it's a match, nothing happens to you. If you say it's an ID and you're wrong, most places in the United States you will be fired, end of story. And if not, you will have it on your record, nobody will respect you, you'll never appear in court, and your colleagues will make fun of you, and you'll be serving coffee for the rest of your life. And this is a very bad culture, but goes back to the adversarial system and to the problem. So that's a big issue that we need to discuss with them. And I can tell you, I sat for 3 years on a DOJ NIST expert working group on error in fingerprint examination, mainly with practitioners. We spent the first 3 days discussing what an error is, because this is what we were going to have a document. Then the second meeting, then the third meeting. After a year, we decided to continue. We have a great document, but we couldn't agree what an error is. But we have a document on reducing error, but we couldn't agree on that. It's a big issue.
Thank you very much for a really interesting talk today, and very dynamic talk too. I have a question that's more related. You talk a lot about the adversarial process. Have there been any studies done in other types of justice systems, and do they actually reduce biases from all of these types of experts?
Generally about experts, I have a paper coming out with a Lord Chief Justice in the UK. And there's one issue of court-appointed experts, and I've heard in a few talks about it, but there's something really nice. It sounds cool. It's from Australia. It's called hot tubbing. Hot tubbing of experts, what happens, who are the juries? Most of them uneducated, people who can't sit more than 25 minutes and listen to evidence, right? And you have two experts coming and arguing. They don't follow the arguments. They don't understand. And what they do in Australia, they say to the two experts, you need to get out of the court. You need to file a joint report. In the joint report, write what you agree on, write what you don't agree and why. And they do that. It's called hot tubbing. They find, number one, that the experts agree on 95% of the things. In court, it gives an impression they agree on nothing because this is what comes out. So it's very clear to the jury, and they file, and the experts do it quite easily if they're real experts, and they agree on 95%. So it's clear what they agree on. Two, on the 5% they don't agree, they say, we don't agree on this. Expert one explains why, expert two, and then they appear in court after they filed a joint report. So that's called hot tubbing. It's done in Australia, and now in the UK it's more common, and maybe in the US, to try to deal with the adversarial system.
Thank you for the talk. So you spoke a bit about doing different areas, so whether it be fingerprinting, DNA. So I'm wondering what your reasoning is to sort of get so specific with each of these rather than potentially saying, well, these are these cognitive processes that we know are going to impact all these different types of groups, and sort of how has that worked out?
I totally agree with you, but I was presenting 2 weeks ago in London in the Royal Society, and a forensic examiner said, well, you haven't shown it. I don't even remember what domain it was. So I said to her, so do you agree with my finding in fingerprints? Yes. Do you agree with my finding with DNA? Yes. Do you agree in forensic anthropology? Medical domain. Pilots. I work with the US Air Force since I was a graduate. Yes, except me, right? It's very easy, you know, the research by Pronin to see bias in others and all. So part of the convincing is data in their specific domain. And then when you show it, they're going to say that I picked bad examiners and so on. So we really do not, and that's what I said to her. First of all, if you have a brain, a human brain, we know a lot about the cognitive processes of expertise, of processing. We don't need to collect any data for the forensic domain. But part of the convincing needs to be done, and it comes up in court where you don't have, so now we're doing fire investigators, firearms. So more and more domains in every domain, and it's a battle, but it's more convincing than actual. The data in some of this area is boring. There are things that are a bit different from domains that make it cognitively, theoretically interesting. I'll mention just one. I don't want to take your lunch, and I see Saul in the background there. But in many forensic domains, they compare, right? They compare DNA, handwriting, firearm, but blood splatter analysis. They come and they see splatter of blood, and they draw conclusions whether it was spitting blood or it's a knife. And here they're not comparing. So it's quite a different cognitive process. They're not looking at similarity. They come up with a story on how the blood splatter analysis. So in that domain, in my view, there's going to be much more degrees of freedom to say what you want. You're not even constrained by a suspect and a pattern, and fine. So there are some differences, but they're not educated. They didn't hear, you know, forensic exam, never heard about cognition, perception, social psychology. None of this existed until relatively recent. Thank you very much.